The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of the federal courthouse as people began gathering outside. Today was different from any other day. Today, everyone would witness something that would change their understanding of justice forever. Inside the courthouse, tension filled the air like thick fog. Court reporters checked their equipment one last time. Security guards took their positions more seriously than usual. Even the janitor who had worked here for 20 years stopped mopping to peek into the main courtroom. The case that brought everyone here was simple to understand, but hard to believe. A man who once promised to help poor communities across the country now stood accused of stealing their money, $500 million. Money that was supposed to build schools, fix roads, and bring hope to places that had been forgotten. The defendant sat quietly at a wooden table, wearing a dark, blue suit that looked like it had seen better days. His lawyer, a woman with graying hair and tired eyes, shuffled through thick folders of papers. She had been working on this case for 2 years, and it showed. Dark circles under her eyes told the story of countless sleepless nights. Judge Patricia Williams entered the courtroom with the kind of presence that made everyone stand up automatically. She had been on the bench for 15 years, and in all that time she had never seen a case quite like this one. The amount of money involved was staggering, but what really got to her were the stories of the people who had been hurt. As people settled into their seats, you could hear a pin drop. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Reporters from major news stations sat in the front rows, their cameras ready to capture every moment. Behind them, community leaders from across the country had traveled here to see justice served. Some wore buttons with pictures of their neighborhoods, showing cracked sidewalks and schools with broken windows. In the back rows sat the defendant's supporters, teachers who remembered him visiting their classrooms, former colleagues who had watched him work late into the night on community projects, family members who knew a different side of the man everyone was calling a criminal. The prosecutor stood up first. He was a tall man with silver hair who had spent his entire career putting corrupt officials behind bars. He buttoned his jacket and walked toward the jury with the confidence of someone who had done this 100 times before. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "Over the next few weeks you will hear about one of the largest cases of public corruption in our nation's history." The defendant sitting over there promised to help communities that had been struggling for decades. Instead, he helped himself to their money. He pointed toward a large chart that showed money flowing from government accounts into private ones. The numbers were so big they almost didn't seem real. $500 million represented thousands of jobs that were never created, schools that were never built, and dreams that were never fulfilled. This money belonged to children who needed better schools, the prosecutor continued. It belonged to families who drove on dangerous roads every day. It belonged to elderly people who couldn't get to medical appointments because their neighborhoods had no public transportation. As he spoke, several people in the courtroom wiped away tears. In the gallery, an older woman clutched a photograph of her grandson, who had been injured when a school ceiling collapsed in their town. The repairs were supposed to have been funded by the very program at the center of this case. The prosecutor spent the next hour laying out his case piece by piece. Bank records showed money disappearing from federal accounts. Phone records revealed meetings that should never have taken place. Email exchanges painted a picture of a man who had lost his way and chosen personal gain over public service. When it was time for the defense to present their opening statement, the courtroom atmosphere shifted. The defendant's lawyer stood up, slowly as if carrying a heavy burden. She looked at the jury for a long moment before speaking. "My client is not the man the prosecution wants you to believe he is," she said quietly. "For 20 years he dedicated his life to public service. He worked in communities that most politicians only visit during election season. He knew the names of children in schools that others had forgotten." She walked over to her client and placed a hand on his shoulder. "The evidence will show that my client tried to expose the real corruption in this program. When he discovered that money was being stolen, he reported it to his supervisors. When nothing happened, he kept digging. That's when they decided to make him the fall guy." The defense lawyer's voice grew stronger as she continued. "The real criminals in this case are still free. They're still collecting government paychecks while my client sits here facing a lifetime in prison for crimes he didn't commit. She presented her own set of documents and charts. These showed a different story. Internal memos revealed that the defendant had raised concerns about missing money months before he was accused. Witness statements from co-workers described him as the most honest person they had ever met in government. As the morning went on, more details emerged about the case. The program in question had been designed to bring federal money to communities that had been left behind by economic growth. Rural towns where factories had closed, inner-city neighborhoods where businesses had moved away, Native American reservations where basic infrastructure had been neglected for decades. The defendant had been put in charge of making sure the money went where it was supposed to go. According to the prosecution, he had created fake companies and phony contracts to steal the funds. According to the defense, he had discovered that others were doing exactly that and had tried to stop them. Judge Williams listened carefully to both sides, taking notes and occasionally asking questions for clarification. She had read every document, in the case file, some of them multiple times. The evidence was complex, but the human cost was simple to understand. Real people in real communities had suffered because money meant to help them had disappeared. During a brief recess, the courtroom buzzed with conversation. Reporters updated their editors about the dramatic opening statements. Community representatives called home to report on what they had heard. The defendant's family hugged each other, trying to stay hopeful despite the serious charges. Outside the courthouse, protesters had gathered on both sides of the issue. Some carried signs demanding justice for the communities that had been cheated. Others held banners proclaiming the defendant's innocence and calling the case a political witch hunt. When court resumed, Judge Williams addressed everyone present. "This case involves serious allegations that have affected many people across our country," she said. "I expect everyone in this courtroom to conduct themselves with dignity and respect. We are here to find the truth, not to pursue vendettas or settle political scores." The first witness was called to the stand. She was a financial expert who had spent months analyzing the money trail at the center of the case. Her testimony was technical and sometimes hard to follow, but her conclusions were clear. Millions of dollars had been moved from legitimate accounts into ones that shouldn't have existed. As she spoke, charts and graphs appeared on screens around the courtroom. The jury leaned forward, trying to understand the complex financial transactions. Some took notes while others stared at the numbers with expressions of disbelief. The defendant watched all of this with a calm expression that gave nothing away. Occasionally, he would whisper something to his lawyer or nod at a point being made. But mostly, he sat still and listened, as if he were watching someone else's trial instead of fighting for his own freedom. By the end of the first day, everyone in the courtroom understood that this case would be about more than just money. It would be about trust in government, about the responsibility that comes with public service, and about whether justice could be found in a system that many people had stopped believing in. As people filed out of the courthouse, the weight of what they had witnessed settled over them. This wasn't just another corruption case that would be forgotten in a few weeks. This was a story that would affect communities across the country for years to come. The defendant left the courthouse flanked by his legal team, saying nothing to the reporters who shouted questions at him. His supporters followed close behind, their faces showing a mixture of hope and worry. Meanwhile, the prosecutor spoke briefly to the media, promising that justice would be served for all the communities that had been betrayed. His words carried the weight of hundreds of families who were counting on this trial to bring some measure of closure to their suffering. Judge Williams was the last to leave, staying behind to review her notes from the day. She knew that the coming weeks would test everything she believed about the law and about justice. The evidence was complicated, the stakes were enormous, and the whole country would be watching every decision she made. Tomorrow would bring more witnesses, more evidence, and more revelations about a case that had already surprised everyone involved. But today had set the stage for a trial that would be remembered long after the final verdict was read. The second week of the trial brought a steady stream of witnesses, each adding another piece to the puzzle that had captivated the entire nation. Outside the courthouse, news vans lined the street like a small city. Inside, every seat remained, filled as people waited to hear what new revelations each day would bring. The prosecution called their star witness on Tuesday morning. He was an accountant who had worked closely with the defendant for 3 years. His hands shook as he raised his right hand to take the oath. Everyone in the courtroom could see that testifying against his former colleague was not easy for him. "I trusted him completely," the accountant said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We worked together on dozens of projects. I never thought he would do something like this." He explained how he had noticed unusual transactions in the accounts he was supposed to monitor. Money would disappear from one account and show up in another, but the paperwork didn't always match. When he asked questions about these transfers, he was told not to worry about it. His supervisor assured him that everything was being handled properly, but the accountant couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He started keeping his own records, copying documents and saving emails. "I wish I had spoken up sooner," he said, looking directly at the defendant for the first time. "Maybe if I had been braver, those communities would have gotten the help they needed." Several jury members leaned forward as he spoke, clearly moved by his obvious regret. The defense lawyer stood up for cross-examination with a gentle approach. She knew that attacking this witness too harshly would backfire with the jury. Instead, she focused on the timeline of events and the pressure the accountant had been under from higher-ups. "You mentioned that your supervisor told you not to worry about the unusual transactions," she said. "Can you tell us who that supervisor was?" The accountant named someone who was not the defendant. This was important for the defense because it suggested that others had been involved in whatever had happened to the money. As the days passed, more financial experts took the stand. They used charts and graphs to show how money had moved through various accounts. Some of these presentations were so complex that Judge Williams had to ask for simpler explanations so the jury could follow along. One particularly compelling witness was a computer specialist who had analyzed thousands of emails and electronic documents. She had created a timeline showing exactly when each suspicious transaction had occurred. What made her testimony so powerful was how she connected the financial evidence to real-world events. "On this date," she said, pointing to her timeline, "money was transferred out of the school construction fund. 3 days later, a contract was signed with a company that, as far as we can tell, never actually existed." She showed the jury examples of fake invoices and phony business licenses that had been used to justify moving the money. But the defense had their own computer expert who told a different story. He had found evidence that someone had been trying to cover their tracks by altering electronic records. Email timestamps had been changed, and some documents appeared to have been created after the fact to make the defendant look guilty. "What we're seeing here is a sophisticated attempt to frame someone," the defense expert explained. "Whoever did this knew enough about computer systems to make it look like the defendant was responsible for transactions he never authorized." This testimony created doubt about some of the prosecution's key evidence. The most emotional part of the trial came during the 3rd week when community representatives began testifying. These were people whose lives had been directly affected by the missing money. Their stories brought the abstract financial evidence down to a human level that everyone could understand. A school principal from a small rural town was the first to take the stand. She had been promised a new gymnasium for her students, money that would have allowed them to compete in sports for the first time in decades. Instead, her kids were still playing basketball in a building that leaked when it rained. "We had already ordered the equipment," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "The kids were so excited they had never had a real basketball court before." She described how she had to tell her students that the promised funding had disappeared. "Some of them cried," she said. "Others just stopped coming to school altogether." A road maintenance supervisor from another state testified about bridges that were supposed to be repaired. One of them had been closed for 2 years because it was unsafe, forcing school buses to take a route that added an hour to each trip. Children were getting home after dark, and parents worried about their safety every day. An elderly woman spoke about the senior center that was never built in her neighborhood. She and her friends had been meeting in each other's homes, but as they got older and their health got worse, it became harder to maintain their community connections. The promised center would have provided meals, medical screenings, and social activities for hundreds of seniors. Each story was more heartbreaking than the last. A young mother talked about the daycare center that was supposed to be built so she could go back to work. A veteran described the job training program that would have helped him transition to civilian life. A teacher explained how the new computers for her classroom never arrived, leaving her students to share outdated equipment that barely worked. But the defense had their own witnesses who painted a very different picture of the defendant. His former secretary testified that he often worked past midnight, calling community leaders to check on projects and making sure money was being spent correctly. She said he kept detailed files on every program he supervised and regularly visited the communities that were supposed to benefit. A construction contractor, who had worked on several projects funded by the program, said the defendant was the most honest government official he had ever met. He would show up at job sites unannounced, the contractor said. He wanted to see for himself that the work was being done right and that the money was being used properly. Several community leaders testified that the defendant had been the first government official to actually listen to their concerns. Unlike others who made promises during election season and then disappeared, he had stayed involved in their projects from beginning to end. When problems arose, he worked to solve them instead of passing the buck to someone else. A particularly powerful defense witness was a whistleblower from another government agency. She had tried to report corruption in federal programs for years, only to be ignored or transferred to different departments. She testified that honest officials like the defendant often became targets when they tried to expose wrongdoing by their superiors. The system protects itself, she said bluntly. When someone like him starts asking too many questions, they find a way to silence him. Making him the scapegoat for crimes committed by others is just another way to keep the real criminals safe. The witness testimony continued. Patterns began to emerge that complicated the simple narrative presented in opening statements. While there was clear evidence that money had been stolen from the program, the question of who was responsible became less clear with each passing day. Phone records showed that the defendant had made numerous calls to oversight agencies, apparently trying to report problems with the program. Bank records revealed that he had actually flagged several suspicious transactions before they were completed. Email chains showed him arguing with superiors about contracts that didn't seem legitimate. The prosecution argued that all of this was just the defendant trying to cover his tracks after getting caught. They pointed to evidence showing that he had signed approval forms for some of the questionable contracts. They also highlighted his access to the accounts from which the money had disappeared. But the defense countered that the defendant's signature had been forged on some documents and that his computer access had been used by others without his knowledge. They presented evidence of lax security in the government office where he worked, showing that multiple people could have used his login credentials to authorize transactions. Judge Williams found herself taking more notes than usual as the evidence mounted on both sides. She had presided over many corruption cases, but this one was different. Usually, the evidence clearly pointed in one direction or the other. Here, every piece of evidence seemed to have an alternative explanation. The jury appeared to be struggling with the same complexity. Some members took extensive notes while others looked confused by the technical testimony. During breaks, they could be seen having animated discussions, clearly trying to make sense of conflicting evidence. Media coverage of the trial intensified as more details emerged. Legal experts on television debated the strength of each side's case. Some believed the prosecution had proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Others thought the defense had raised enough questions to create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors. Community groups organized rallies both supporting and opposing the defendant. Those who believed he was guilty saw him as a symbol of everything wrong with government corruption. Those who thought he was innocent viewed him as a victim of a system that punished honest people for trying to do the right thing. As the fourth week of testimony began, everyone involved in the trial could feel the weight of the decision that lay ahead. The evidence phase was nearly complete, and soon it would be time for closing arguments and jury deliberation. Whatever verdict was reached would affect not just the defendant, but all the communities that had been counting on the money that had disappeared. The courtroom remained packed every day, with people traveling from across the country to witness what many were calling the most important corruption trial in decades. Everyone understood that the outcome would set a precedent. for how similar cases would be handled in the future. After 6 weeks of testimony, closing arguments, and 3 days of jury deliberation, the moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, supporters from both sides, and curious onlookers who had followed the case from the beginning. Inside, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Judge Williams entered at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, just as she had every day of the trial. But today felt different. Today, the weight of 6 weeks of evidence and emotional testimony would finally be resolved. She took her seat and looked out at the packed courtroom before speaking. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. The jury foreman, a retired teacher who had been taking careful notes throughout the trial, stood up slowly. In his hand was a single piece of paper that would change everything. "We have, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady but serious. The defendant stood up beside his lawyer, his hands clasped behind his back. For the first time during the entire trial, he looked nervous. His family members in the front row held hands and closed their eyes, preparing for whatever was coming. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, how do you find?" Judge Williams asked. The foreman looked down at the paper in his hands, then back up at the judge. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. "Guilty," he said. The word hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Several people gasped audibly. In the gallery, some of the community representatives who had traveled here seeking justice began to cry with relief. The defendant's wife covered her face with her hands while his grown daughter reached over to hold his arm. But the verdicts weren't finished yet. There were multiple charges, and each one had to be read aloud. "On the charge of theft of federal funds, how do you find?" Judge Williams continued. "Guilty." "On the charge of money laundering, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of abuse of public trust, how do you find?" "Guilty." With each guilty verdict, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. The defendant remained standing throughout, showing no visible emotion, even as his life was being destroyed one charge at a time. His lawyer placed a supportive hand on his shoulder, but there was nothing she could do now except prepare for the sentencing phase. When all the verdicts had been read, Judge Williams thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. Several jury members were visibly emotional as they filed out of the courtroom. The retired teacher who had served as foreman stopped briefly to look back at the defendant, his expression showing the difficulty of the decision they had just made. The defendant was allowed to remain free on bail until sentencing, which would take place in 2 weeks. This was unusual for such serious charges, but Judge Williams had been impressed by his conduct throughout the trial and didn't consider him a flight risk. As he left the courthouse that day, reporters shouted questions at him, but he said nothing. Those 2 weeks felt like an eternity for everyone involved. The defendant spent his time getting his affairs in order and saying goodbye to family and friends. He knew that the sentence would likely mean many years in prison, possibly the rest of his life. His legal team worked frantically to prepare arguments for a lighter sentence. They gathered letters from community leaders who still believed in his innocence, from former colleagues who vouched for his character, and from family members who described the man they knew behind the public figure. Meanwhile, the prosecution prepared their own sentencing arguments. They compiled victim impact statements from dozens of communities that had been affected by the missing money. Each statement told a story of broken promises and lost opportunities that painted a picture of widespread harm. The day of sentencing arrived on a cold Monday morning in late November. The courthouse was once again packed, but the atmosphere was different now. The uncertainty of the trial had been replaced by the grim certainty of punishment. Everyone knew they were about to witness the end of a man's career and freedom. Judge Williams had spent many sleepless nights preparing for this moment. She had reviewed every piece of evidence, read every victim impact statement, and considered every argument for mercy. The law gave her some discretion in sentencing, but the guidelines were clear about the severity of the crimes. The defendant entered the courtroom wearing the same dark blue suit he had worn throughout the trial. His family sat in the front row, their faces showing the strain of the past 2 weeks. His elderly mother, who had attended every day of the trial, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The prosecutor stood first to argue for the maximum sentence. He reminded the court of the enormous scope of the crimes and the number of people who had been hurt. $500 million, he said, letting the number hang in the air. That's not just a number on a bank statement. That's thousands of children who didn't get the education they deserved. That's families who continue to drive on dangerous roads. That's seniors who lost their gathering place and their sense of community. He displayed photographs of some of the unfinished projects. A half-built school that had been abandoned when the money ran out. A bridge that remained closed because repairs were never completed. A community center that existed only in architectural drawings. The defendant held a position of tremendous trust, the prosecutor continued. People believed in him. Communities put their faith in his promises. He betrayed that trust in the worst possible way, and the consequences of his actions will be felt for generations. When it was time for the defense to speak, the defendant's lawyer approached the podium with obvious reluctance. She had fought hard for her client throughout the trial, but now she faced the impossible task of asking for mercy for crimes that had hurt so many people. Your Honor, she began, my client has already lost everything that mattered to him. His reputation, his career, and his standing in the community are gone forever. He knows that no sentence you impose can undo the harm that has been done. But he also knows that destroying his life completely will not rebuild a single school or repair a single road. She presented letters from people who had known the defendant for decades. Teachers spoke of his dedication to education. Community volunteers described his tireless work on local projects. Former colleagues remembered him as someone who genuinely cared about making a difference. The man described in these letters is not the monster portrayed by the prosecution, she said. He is a human being who made terrible mistakes and who will spend the rest of his life regretting them. But he is also someone who spent 20 years trying to help others, and that has to count for something. Judge Williams listened carefully to both arguments, occasionally taking notes, but mostly just absorbing the weight of the decision she had to make. When both sides had finished their presentations, she asked if the defendant wanted to make a statement before sentencing. The defendant stood slowly, his lawyer rising beside him. For a moment he just looked around the courtroom, taking in the faces of all the people whose lives had been touched by this case. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and clear. I want to start by saying that I accept responsibility for my role in these events, he said. The jury has spoken and I respect their decision. I know that many people have been hurt by what happened and I am deeply sorry for that. He paused, collecting his thoughts before continuing. I spent my entire career trying to serve the public. Good. I believed in the programs we were implementing and the communities we were trying to help. I know that what I'm about to say may sound hollow given the verdicts, but I never intended for anyone to be harmed. Several people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably as he spoke. Some of the community representatives looked skeptical, while others seemed to be listening with open minds. I understand that people need someone to blame for the failures of these programs, he continued. I understand that my conviction may bring some closure to the communities that were promised help and didn't receive it. If my punishment can somehow contribute to preventing this from happening to others, then perhaps some good can come from this tragedy. Judge Williams watched him carefully as he spoke, noting the sincerity in his voice even as she prepared to deliver a sentence that would effectively end his life as a free man. When the defendant finished speaking, Judge Williams took a deep breath and began to deliver the sentence that everyone had been waiting to hear. The crimes you have been convicted of represent a profound breach of public trust, she said. The evidence presented at trial shows that $500 million in federal funds was diverted from its intended purpose, depriving communities across this nation of critical resources. She continued methodically through each charge, explaining the legal requirements for sentencing and the factors she had considered. The courtroom remained completely silent as she spoke, everyone hanging on every word. Taking into account the severity of these crimes, their impact on vulnerable communities, and the need to deter others from similar conduct, I hereby sentence you to 25 years in federal prison, she announced. Additionally, you are ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $500 million, representing the full amount of funds that were diverted from their intended purpose. The gasp that went through the courtroom was audible. 25. Years meant the defendant, who was 58 years old, would likely spend the rest of his productive life behind bars. The $500 million restitution order, while largely symbolic given his financial situation, sent a clear message about the court's view of the crime's severity. As the sentence was read, the defendant remained standing, showing no visible reaction to words that had just changed his life forever. The gavel had fallen. The sentence had been delivered. 25 years in prison and $500 million in restitution. For most people in the courtroom, this was the end of the story. Justice had been served, and it was time to move on with their lives. But what happened next would change everything everyone thought they knew about this case. As Judge Williams prepared to adjourn the court for the final time, the defendant did something unexpected. Instead of sitting down or being led away by the bailiffs, he remained standing at the defendant's table. His lawyer tugged gently at his sleeve, trying to get him to sit, but he stayed where he was. "Your Honor," he said quietly, his voice barely carrying across the courtroom. "May I request permission to make one final statement?" The request was unusual, almost unheard of after sentencing. Normally, defendants either remained silent or were quickly escorted from the courtroom to begin serving their time. Judge Williams looked surprised, but something in the defendant's manner made her pause. "This is highly irregular," she said, glancing at the prosecution table where the lawyers looked equally puzzled. "You've already had your opportunity to speak before sentencing." "I understand, Your Honor," the defendant replied, "but there's something I need to say. Not for myself, but for the communities that have been hurt by all of this." His words carried a weight that made everyone in the courtroom pay attention, even those who had been preparing to leave. Judge Williams studied his face for a long moment. Throughout the entire trial, she had watched him carefully, trying to understand the man behind the charges. She had seen defendants who were angry, defiant, broken, or desperate. But this man seemed different somehow, even now in his moment of complete defeat. "Very well," she said finally. "You may speak, but keep it brief." The defendant nodded his thanks and turned to face the courtroom. His family sat in the front row, their faces streaked with tears. Behind them were the community representatives, who had traveled from across the country to see justice done. In the back were reporters who had covered every day of the trial, their cameras ready to capture whatever came next. When he began to speak, his voice was steady but filled with an emotion that hadn't been there during his earlier statement. "I want to talk about something that goes beyond this courtroom in this case," he said. "I want to talk about the children who are sitting in classrooms right now with leaking roofs and broken windows." Several people in the courtroom exchanged glances. This wasn't what they had expected to hear from a man who had just been sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. "I want to talk about the grandmother who can't visit her doctor because the bridge in her neighborhood is still closed. I want to talk about the teenager who dreams of going to college, but goes to a school that doesn't have enough books." His words began to resonate through the silent courtroom. "For the past 6 weeks, this trial has been about me. About what I did or didn't do, about whether I'm guilty or innocent. But while we've been sitting in this courtroom, those children are still in those broken schools. That grandmother is still trapped in her neighborhood. That teenager is still studying from outdated textbooks." Judge Williams found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn in by his words despite herself. Around the courtroom, people who had been ready to leave were settling back into their seats. "I know that many of you see me as the villain in this story," the defendant continued. "The jury has declared me guilty and I accept that judgment. But I want you to know that every single day for the past 20 years, I thought about those communities. I thought about those children. I thought about all the people who were counting on programs like the one at the center of this case." He paused, looking directly at some of the community representatives in the gallery. "I failed you. Whether I'm legally guilty or not, I failed you. The money that was supposed to help your communities is gone. The promises that were made to you were broken. And for that I am truly sorry." An elderly woman from one of the affected communities wiped tears from her eyes. She had come to the trial seeking justice, expecting to feel satisfaction when the defendant was punished. but his words were stirring something different in her heart. "But here's what I want you to remember," the defendant said, his voice growing stronger. "My conviction doesn't build a single school. My prison sentence doesn't repair a single road. My punishment doesn't create a single job or feed a single hungry child." The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Even the reporters had stopped taking notes and were simply listening. "The real tragedy isn't what happens to me. The real tragedy is that we've spent 6 weeks talking about the past, while those communities continue to suffer in the present." He gestured toward the gallery where community leaders sat. "These people didn't travel hundreds of miles just to see me punished. They came here because they still have hope that somehow, some way, their communities can get the help they need." Judge Williams felt something stirring in her chest as she listened. In 15 years on the bench, she had heard countless statements, from defendants trying to minimize their crimes or seek sympathy. But this felt different. This felt genuine. "I want to challenge everyone in this courtroom," the defendant continued. "I want to challenge the prosecutors who worked so hard to convict me. I want to challenge the reporters who have covered this story. I want to challenge the politicians who will use this case to score points. And yes, I want to challenge myself, even though I'll be spending the next 25 years in prison." He turned to look directly at Judge Williams. "Your Honor, you have the power to send me to prison, and you have exercised that power justly. But all of us in this room have the power to do something more important. We have the power to make sure that the communities represented here today don't have to wait another 25 years for the help they need." The defendant's lawyer was staring at her client in amazement. This wasn't the statement she had expected, or prepared him for. Around the courtroom, people were beginning to react emotionally to his words. "I know this might sound strange coming from someone who has just been convicted of stealing from these communities," he said, "but I want to ask all of you to look beyond this case. Look beyond me. Look at the faces of the people in this courtroom who are still waiting for promises to be kept." He pointed toward the gallery where a school principal sat. "That woman has students who deserve better than what they're getting. That man over there has neighbors who need safe roads to drive on. That couple in the third row has grandchildren who need parks to play in and libraries to learn in." As he spoke, several people in the gallery began to nod. They had come seeking justice, but they were hearing something else entirely. They were hearing a call to action that went beyond punishment and retribution. "I may have failed these communities, but that doesn't mean everyone else has to fail them too," the defendant said. "The federal government will continue to fund programs for underserved areas. There will be other officials making decisions about where that money goes. There will be other opportunities to make a difference." Judge Williams found herself deeply moved by his words, though she tried not to show it. She had presided over hundreds of cases, but she had never heard a defendant use his final moments of freedom to advocate for others rather than himself. "I want to make a promise to everyone in this courtroom," the defendant said. "Even from prison, I will do everything I can to help these communities get the resources they need. I will write letters. I will make phone calls. I will use whatever influence I have left to make sure that other officials don't make the same mistakes I made." He looked around the courtroom one final time. "But I can't do it alone. None of us can. It's going to take all of us working together. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, reporters, community leaders, and ordinary citizens, to make sure that justice isn't just about punishment, but about making things better for the people who have been hurt." The defendant's voice began to break slightly as he reached the end of his statement. 25 years from now, when I'm released from prison, I want to visit these communities and see thriving schools, safe roads, and happy children. I want to see that my failure became a catalyst for something better, not just an excuse for giving up." He turned back to Judge Williams. "Your Honor, I thank you for allowing me to speak. I know that I have no right to ask for anything more, but I hope that my words today will inspire others to take up the cause that I failed to serve properly." As the defendant finished speaking and finally sat down, the courtroom remained silent for several long moments. Then slowly something extraordinary began to happen. Judge Williams, known for her composure and professional demeanor, began to show signs of deep emotion. Her eyes filled with tears, as the weight of the defendant's words settled over her. She had expected to feel satisfaction at the completion of a complex case. Instead, she found herself profoundly moved by a statement that had transformed a moment of punishment into a call for hope and action. "Court is adjourned," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. But as the defendant was led away and people began to file out of the courtroom, everyone knew that something important had just happened, something that would be remembered long after the news cameras were gone and the reporters had filed their final stories. The trial was over, but the real work was just beginning.